Hello. Welcome back to another episode of the Unprofessional Entrepreneur. Today I am very excited because I am joined by Chelsea, who is someone that I have said for so long in my head that I wanted to invite on the show. And I was like, what am I waiting for? So, welcome to the show. If you want to introduce yourself and let the people know what you're all about.
Yes, I'm so excited. I love the name of your podcast because I feel very much like it describes me. I am Chelsea Riffe. I am a podcast host. Funny enough, have a podcast called In My Non-Expert Opinion, which I think is very much in line with the professional entrepreneur. And I'm
Hmm.
also a podcast coach. So I help people launch their podcasts, grow their podcasts. And recently I'm pivoting a lot into pitching. So teaching people how to pitch guests for their podcasts or pitch themselves on podcasts. It's really anything to do with like podcasting, storytelling, pitching. That's what I do. So, and recently I started a Substack called Slight Turbulence. I launched it maybe 8 months ago, and it's about my digital nomad lifestyle, dating on the road, the ups and downs of, being nomadic. And I know if anyone gets it, it's you. So I'm excited to be here today.
I love it because you are living like my dream life because my husband is not nomadic and I'm just like, I just want to be changing countries every 6 months. And so I see you like bopping around Europe. Now you're in South Africa and I'm just like, I would love to go live in South Africa for 6 months or go live in Colombia for 6 months. Um, that's like, I'm really hoping that after this year in France, like that's what's next. But also, I am a big fan of podcasting, hence this show. And I actually didn't start my show for like 2 years. And I spent that 2 years guessing on podcasts. And I was like, well, it's the best of both worlds. I get to speak on podcasts. I don't have to do any of the editing or any of the anything really, like being a guest.
Nothing.
And I think it's so powerful for visibility, for like lead generation and all of that. So I would love to hear like a little bit about your journey into podcasting because I know you started as a yoga teacher. So
Yeah. You're like, what was that pipeline?
yeah.
And even before yoga teaching, I worked in corporate. So yeah, how I ended up in podcasting, it actually makes sense when you hear the whole thing. So basically the quick timeline is I always wanted to be a sports reporter. I wanted to be on television doing some type of hosting. So that was my undergrad, and my master's degree was focused on broadcast journalism, hosting, reporting, anything that I could create a story around. That was what I got my education in. Then
Mm.
at my career fair in my grad school, I found a job in influencer and content marketing. And so it was a sales job. And I actually didn't even know it was a sales job. I thought I was being hired to be like a talent agent because in their hiring process, they were showing pictures of Kim Kardashian and like Jesse James Decker and all these celebrities. And it was because they were like the first influencers to start doing sponsored posts and paid placement. I thought our company was like a talent agency management company. So I was like, "Oh my god, I'm going to work directly with the Kardashians." Like I was insane, and then I got into the role and they're like, "What are you talking about? You're selling our software that finds influencers, and we're going to be talking to media agencies and brands." And I was like, "What are we like I did not know what my job was for 6 months. I was like, I did not know I was a salesperson. And eventually I was like, "Okay, I get it. I have a quota. I have to hit this." So funny enough, everything that I learned in undergrad actually did help me in my job because it was all about storytelling, visuals, etc. So we would talk about, setting up influencers with brands to tell a story. So I did that for 5 years. I moved up the ladder really quickly in my company, and I was just like, I don't like this. Like, I'm helping snack brands become multi-billion-dollar companies. People are, jumping down my throat because someone didn't hold up the pretzel properly in the photo. And I was like, this is so stupid. Like, I cannot be in this job anymore. So I was making great money. I was traveling all over the US. Like, I would get sent to conferences in New York and LA and everywhere. And it kind of felt like I was living the American dream. I lived in Chicago. I was going to a WeWork every day. I was going out to drinks with clients. Like it was very like what you think a cool big girl job is. But the stress I was going through, the type of work I was doing, I was like, this like really is not fun at all. So I quit. I moved to Australia, and I was going on like an eat, pray, love journey. Um, while I was in Australia, I was like, you know what? It would be fun to get my yoga certification. So I ended up going to Bali for a month, getting my yoga
Of course.
certification. Yeah, I was like, naturally, I have to do the eat, pray, love thing, and that was part of it. And I ran out of money too in Australia. So I was blowing my money, doing absolutely nothing in Australia for like 6 months. And then I started doing a bunch of random jobs. Like I was scooping gelato. I worked at a music agency. I did influencer marketing for a yoga studio. I mean, I was doing like anything that anyone would give me. I was just trying to make ends meet. Then the pandemic hits. Everyone starts doing online workout classes. And I'm like, oh, well, you teach yoga, so you can teach yoga online. So then I got a little delusional and I was like, I'm going to become like the next yoga guru. Like I'm going to be, yoga with Adrienne. Everyone loves her on YouTube, or like Melissa Wood Health blew up with her Pilates app. And I was like, that's going to be me. I started talking to PR agencies and thinking of hiring uh, I don't even know. I wanted to be in like magazines for yoga. I was like insane. I wanted to develop an app. So I went really all in with this yoga thing for like 3 months. And then literally 90 days in, I was like, nope, I don't want to do this either. So I eventually was like, what are you like? You need to pick something that's long term that kind of aligns with what your vision had to do when you first started all this, was like telling stories. I had always had my podcast since 2017, and it was just like a fun hobby. Um, and then when the pandemic hit and I started realizing, like, what are you really going to do that's not teaching yoga? I thought of the mindset principles that I learned in yoga, and like mindfulness and breathing and gratitude, etc. So I was like, let me become a mindset coach. And so I started talking about that on my podcast. And eventually my first course enrollment was a huge success. And I was like, I don't understand where all these people are coming from. Like I just started mindset coaching. I didn't build my brand around this. People still think I'm a yoga teacher. And everyone kept saying, I've been listening to your podcast for years, or I've heard you on podcasts. And then it kind of started clicking, like, wow, I like telling stories. People are finding me from podcasts. It's helping my business. I'm getting more visibility. I get to talk to other people and tell their stories. And then my wheels just started spinning. And I was like, I think I should actually really end up doing something with podcasting. So again, I had my podcast for so long that I also knew the ropes. Like I knew everything about podcasting. So after about a year and a half of doing the mindset coaching thing, I was like, I think we need to pivot to podcast stuff. So then that's when I started helping people launch their podcast, grow it. And it helps because I had all this experience myself and seen the success of being a guest on other podcasts, as well as pitching. I mean, if you think about it too, sales is pitching. So my sales job for 5 years was constantly pitching brands and influencers and everything on ideas. So all of it mixed together turned out to be not only fun for me, but a lot more sustainable. And so now that's how I ended up being on this path of like podcasting and pitching and doing it myself as well.
I think that's so interesting that you've had your show since 2017, because you're like an OG podcaster. Like 2017 is when I was listening to, what was that show called? Like Ear Hustle or something, about the guys in San Quentin who like started a podcast. And as I drove across Australia, like that was what I listened to.
I remember Serial.
Yeah,
I remember
listened to
Serial was the
Serial,
big
but
one.
I think that must have been a little sooner because I was still in Vancouver when I listened to that.
Yeah, it was like 2015, 2016 was probably Serial.
Yeah, maybe 2016 when I listened to it. But I'm curious, like, has your show always been, in my non-expert opinion, has it always been like similar topics of like, you talk about anything, right? But like, how has it evolved over the last 7 years?
Well, I started it. I wanted to start a podcast for a very long time. I always wanted to do something again with like reporting, hosting, telling stories. And I just couldn't figure out the medium. Like I tried blogging, I tried YouTube, I tried Instagram, and then podcasting just clicked. I was like, oh my God, we don't have to do video. I could record this in my bed. This is before video podcasting, right? Like
Yeah.
video podcasting would be considered weird back then. So I was like, this is so cool. And I just remember being like, had this strike of lightning motivation, which has only happened twice in my life, is when I started my podcast and when I started my business. And it's this like adrenaline rush that you're like, I have to figure everything out by tonight. So I was like, went on Canva, made a logo, was like running around, figuring out, like going to, my host site and uploading my first episode. And it was called, my first podcast name was called Oh My Pod. And that was to be the reason This is such a funny story. I was looking at the top charts to see what was ranking for the names, like what shows ranked really high. And there was one called Pod Save America. And I remember thinking,
Oh,
oh,
that's good.
obviously pod is replacing God. So then I started thinking of like, what has the word God in it without me being like a a religious person. I was like, wait, oh my God, like, oh my pod, OMG. Like, I didn't know that. Oh my God. Like, everything we react to always is like, OMG, OMG. So I was like, I'm going to do a play on that and call it Oh My Pod. So it was actually called Oh My Pod for maybe almost 2 years. And then eventually I started taking it more seriously and I Googled Oh My Pod. There was another Oh My Pod that had done 800 episodes. That is so many. That is more than like any OG podcaster I know. Like they were posting all the time. So the SEO was really competitive. It was like my show, I had the website domain, but then they had the YouTube, but I had the Instagram, but they had the Twitter. And I was like, this is a mess. And people were saying, like, yeah, it's kind of confusing when I look you up. There's another Oh My Pod that has 800 episodes that's like these two random guys. So eventually I was like, okay, I should change mine because they have more episodes. And the name wasn't really special or anything, right? It was just like,
Mhm.
I was just one of those like impulsive decisions. So also, I don't know if you remember this, back in the day, there was this Canva logo that everyone had, and it was like a scribble with like, I don't know, looked like a crayon scribble and then a circle. And I just remember seeing it on like anyone that didn't have a graphic designer used this as their logo. And that was my logo from Canva for the podcast. So very unprofessional, very like, whatever, let's just do this. And then eventually when I decided to change the name, I'm trying to think of how I came up with the idea. I think I was talking to my mom at a restaurant or something. And I was just saying, like, I have a lot of opinions and I don't really feel like I'm an expert in all these things, but I don't want to have to be an expert. Like, I don't want to be one of
Mhm.
these podcasts that's like, we're going to only talk to experts in the field. I was like, I don't want to be that. And then I thought of when a doctor gives you an opinion and they're like, well, in my expert opinion, you should go get surgery. And so I was thinking, well, what's the opposite of that? And I was like, well, in my non expert opinion, you should try this because I was going to bring people on that were not just experts. So that's how the name came to be. It started out very health and wellness focused. This was like peak health and wellness podcast era where everyone
Mhm.
was like on, anything we could improve about our health. That's what people were talking about. So it was very focused on that for like 2 years. Then it shifted a lot into like spirituality. And that was during my like yoga era, spirituality, mysticism, astrology. Like I got really into that. That went on for like a year and a half. Then I started traveling and was in a relationship. So then I got into like relationships, dating, traveling. It's really a reflection of where I'm at in my life. So if you ever
Mhm.
go back and like stalk my episodes, you can just see where I was in my life. It's very much like, oh, that's the period where I was going through heartbreak. That's when I started traveling. That's when I started my business. And so then when I started my business, it started shifting more into like entrepreneurship and the lessons I've learned and, what I would have changed. And lately it's been a lot about creativity and money and the rituals that creatives and artists have. And it's because I'm really interested in that because I started writing last year. Like I've always written, but not kind of like as a fun thing. And last year I
Mhm.
put out my writing publicly on Substack. And I remember being like, I don't understand how people publish books. Like, I don't get it. I literally don't understand the process of like making chapter after chapter and a 300-page book and editing and getting the conversations right. Like, how do you remember the conversations? And can you make things up? Do you have to change people's names? Like, I got so down this rabbit hole that's what started fascinating me. And then what the podcast started becoming about is like, how do people do what they do? And lately, that's really been my focal point is like, I want to get into the brains of like really creative, really like kind of chaotic, mindful people that are like what kind of eccentric people, to be honest. Like, I would love to interview more people that are like off the beaten path, but have produced some really great work. So that's how the podcast changed its name. And that's how I decide what to post is like, what am I into right now and what am I feeling?
I can't even remember who sent me your profile, but I remember listening to your show and I definitely like I'm someone who will like just scroll through until I find something that stands out to me and I want to say like I started listening to the travel episodes obviously. um, But now I love the like money, the creativity. Like I'm working to get myself out of like consumer debt that I have accumulated. And so like listening to your journey and then like what you've done, the podcast you've listened to, like I found it all so interesting. And I love what you said about how like your podcast is literally a reflection of where you're at in your life, because it is a creative endeavor. And I think so often like people try to crush their creativity, or like only talk about like things that are past and not current, and that takes away from the emotion in it. So like with your whole base of storytelling, like it just, I think that's really cool that it has translated so clearly in your podcast. And like I do follow your Substack. I'm not a paid subscriber, and like all the time I'm like, maybe I'll just subscribe now, because like every time there's the email of like, this is for paid subscribers only, I'm like, ugh, like where's
Like,
the free
ooh,
ones?
you're gonna get you're gonna get a really good paid one soon. It's about my speed dating event at a masquerade party. So
That
that one
sounds
is gonna
so
be worth
fun.
it. That's gonna be worth it. But yeah, I love that you um I, I didn't want me to interrupt you, but I love that you did
Yeah.
find something that resonated and then like switched, because I think podcasters tend to think, well, I started talking about travel, so I have to continue talking about travel because that's what people know me for, is travel. And I don't know what else to talk about, when in reality it's like we all
That's not
have
my entire
45,000
life.
sides to us. Yeah, like
Yeah.
I'm also not a travel agent. Like that's not my job, that's not my business. Like I want what I do at the core is telling stories. So I'm like, that's what I want to get to. So I just think like quick nugget of advice for anyone listening is like, if you start down one path, don't be afraid to expand and open up, because Felly is a perfect example. Like you started listening to travel stuff, but then you're like, I actually am more interested now in the money and the creativity. And I think that's totally okay.
And also like when you were saying how you went from yoga, spirituality, and then into like mindset coaching, and you were signing clients that came from the podcast, even though your podcast before had nothing to do with like, or wasn't specifically focused on, right? It's like you can
Right.
always be building that community and they'll come with you. Like whenever
Yes.
I see people that want to start over from scratch, like delete their Instagram or delete their entire email list, I'm like, I would way rather be like, unfollow me if you're not interested, but like
Yes.
keep going, because like all
Yes.
that work like just compounds.
It does. And I think people like to watch your journey. Like, this is
Mm-hmm.
such a random example. I don't even know how this is coming into my brain right now. But yesterday on Instagram, Eminem's daughter, Haley Jade, got
Mm-hmm.
married. And people were commenting, like, oh my God, I feel like I grew up with her. Like, is anyone feeling emotional about this? And I'm thinking of like, yeah, all the songs with Haley Jade, like we barely even know her, but because he rapped about her for so long, we feel so invested in her journey. And now people are crying over a rapper's daughter getting married because they felt like, I was so into her journey, how she went from this like kid to teen to now getting married. And I'm like, again, I know this doesn't directly relate to bringing your community with you, but like people like to watch your journey. People like to know, like there's someone that still listens to my podcast that knew me when I was like the broke backpacker in Australia and has seen me go through my relationship breakup and seen me get back into dating. And like that's really, that's, we're all humans, like we can all relate to that. So thinking like, oh, I have to stay talking about travel is, it's kind of like one dimensional and not that interesting long term, to be honest.
Yeah, I completely agree. Like there's something humanizing about following someone's journey. Whether you follow it from the start or you get to hear the stories later on, right? Like it's like, oh, I went through that too. Like I went the stereotypical like general VA, content writer, content agency. Now I do content repurposing, right? So like my journey is very typical of people in the online space, of like you started as a general VA just trying to do anything to make it work and figure it out until you found what you
Right.
liked. And
Mm-hmm.
every time I share that story, as much as it's like, yeah, it's general, it's nothing new, it's nothing exciting, people will come out of the woodwork and be like, hey, like I relate to you. I did the same thing. Like we have similar timelines. And like they get excited to have that connection
Yes.
point. So it's like, don't
100%.
take that away from them. Like don't try and like hide
No.
your history.
No, that's what makes you literally have a connection point. To your point is like, I was just listening to one of my clients' podcasts, she's a human design expert. And you would think all her episodes would be like human design and the gates and the channels and this and that. And they're actually very personal. Like she just did a whole one about her eating journey and how modeling was really toxic and prompted this whole thing. And I was like, wow, I feel so connected to her now because of all she shared. And now
Mhm.
I'm actually probably signing up for her program in June just because I feel connected to what she shared about her like chaotic eating past. Like, you know what I mean? Like it had nothing to do with like human design and here's the channel. And I was like, it's because I feel like she's a human being that I want to be in her energy. And I think that that's what podcasting does is it shows your personality, your energy, what you believe in, what you find important. And I think that's what people want to actually buy from is not, oh, the product has 6 calls and we meet twice a week on Zoom. And it's like, that's
Mhm.
great, but who's the one leading it? Like that's what we want to actually be around.
Yeah, and like I talked about this in a different episode. I did like a marketing stack episode for 2024 a few weeks ago, and I was saying how my podcast is about the personality. And right now all I sell is content repurposing, like Done For You and the remix. And my podcast doesn't necessarily every single episode focus on content repurposing. I talk about
Right.
case studies, I talk about like different marketing that I'm doing, I talk about like my threads experience, right? And it's like those episodes are the ones that make me sales more than the ones that are like, okay, like this is my approach to content repurposing, this is what you're doing wrong, blah blah blah, because it shows what makes me different than the 100 other people offering the same offer service.
100%. I love
Mm.
hearing that. I love those like success stories that you're like, it's so funny too when you do a solo episode and you're like, I remember doing this one episode maybe 3 years ago, also about money. And I remember thinking this is very unprofessional. And my mom even said, I don't think you should post this. Like, you're kind of telling people what you're bad at in your business, and people probably don't want to invest in like a bad business owner. You know what I mean? Like, I like didn't know how to manage my money and what softwares to use. And
Mm-hmm.
I was kind of admitting that on air. And I just remember thinking, like, but this is when I think of people's podcasts I listen to, the reason I got so invested in their journey is because they did show the ugly side of like, here's actually what really happened and what you didn't see on Instagram. And so I just thought, well, I wish more people would be a little more transparent and honest. So I posted that basically saying I'm not that great of a business owner. And like 3 people were like, I would love to work with you. I relate so much to that. How can I work with you one on one? And I was like, this kind of doesn't make sense. Like from a strategy perspective, you know what I mean? Like saying that
Yeah.
you're not great at something and then people being like, I want to work with you and pay you money seems like it would be a competing message or energy. And again, it shows because we were human. We showed that very complex side that we have, and that's what people actually want to invest in.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would love to in terms of like unprofessional, out of the ballpark, like podcast episodes, podcast topics, I feel like every time I see you sharing something that you guested on, like it's never about podcasting. It's like travel
Yeah.
journeys, it's like dating, it's like astrology, and like I look at the shows you're on, and I've never heard of any of them. And I'm always like, where where do you find these random shows with these random topics? And like that's besides the point. The real question I have though is like, I know you're seeing results, but like can you share results that you're seeing through the non-strategized, for lack of a better word, like guesting?
Yeah, I think it goes back to the human piece.
Mhm.
I think really what it is, because I do study like storytelling a lot, it really is like part of my job, is people love specifics, and specifics are what create memories. So for example, if I just went on every podcast and was like, podcasting is great. 78% of people listen to podcasts, and you know what I mean? Like, did that and that and that, it just becomes very generic. But when I start
Mhm.
giving specific stories, even if it doesn't really relate to podcasting, it does relate to storytelling. And storytelling is podcasting. So like in a way, it does all tie together. And um I think there is always a tie when I go on podcasts. Like, for example, I was on a human design podcast. Their podcast is very like mystical, talking about Akashic records and shamanism and astrology and all these things. And I remember thinking, like, I don't teach people how to podcast through the lens of human design or astrology. I'm not like, oh, here's how to do it. But I
Mhm.
infuse a lot of those things into my work. Like I am someone that I have a moon calendar on my Google Calendar, and like I like to track my cycle and record when I'm in my ovulation phase. Like these are things that I do. So I find these little points that I can bring up in podcasts that again aren't necessarily like technical or strategy, that we can go on and on for an hour about how I'm a reflector in human design, but then it does tie into like how I work or how I storytell or how I do my business. And then that's what ends up driving people to my platforms. They're like, oh my God, I didn't realize that. So it's interesting because a few years ago when I was in Germany, I remember journaling and being like, I really want to work with people who are a little bit out of the box. Like I like working with people that are into spiritual um worlds or like esoteric concepts. And it's funny because I just launched this program called Pitch Perfect about guesting on podcasts, and everyone in the group is like a psychic medium, a human design reader, a intuitive guide, an alignment. And I was like, this makes sense because they found me on a lot of these podcasts that I was on. And again, it didn't have anything to do with like I'm an expert in any of these things, but I did find a way to still tie it into storytelling or how it's helped my like life, or it is part of my personality. So I think that's why I've seen success, even though they're like kind of random.
Yeah, but it's like you attract the people that you're like, they're your people at the end of the day, right? Like maybe they're not
Exactly.
all business owners or like in the entrepreneur space, like maybe they're side hustlers, maybe they're just like offering it because they feel called to, and they're not even like charging for it, but they want to start a podcast or they want to speak about it more, and that's why they've found you, or they followed you because they liked something that you mentioned one time on some show, right? It's like
Exactly.
then when you get out there and you actually sell something, you never know who it's going to speak to.
Right. And some people will follow you after hearing a show, but not necessarily want to invest in your work. Some people might
Hmm.
just be like, oh, I can relate. Like, I went on a lot of podcasts talking about my digital nomad lifestyle. And there were parts of digital nomad lifestyle that are very lonely and isolating and ugly. And like, it's not that fun or as great as it seems online. And people started following me after that, like, wow, I'm a digital nomad too. And yeah, dating on the road is really hard. And so they would follow me. And then, like, 6 to 12 months later, would actually buy my course or invest in my work. And so sometimes it's not an immediate payoff. It's not like, boom, one on one applications are blowing up, but it's the fact that they got invested in my journey. And then eventually one of my offers made sense for them, which I think is really cool too, that
Hmm.
it doesn't have to be so immediate.
Yeah, and it's like we were saying earlier, like they might not buy from this evolution of your business. Like you might pivot later and they'll buy, or where they're at in their life right now isn't right for your offers, but in 6 months down the line, their life might change and they might be like, actually, I do want
100%.
to launch a podcast, even though I said forever I would never even consider it. Right. And it's
Right.
like, then
Exactly.
they end up buying eventually. And it's like even the people who don't end up like buying directly from you, they still talk about you and share your profile. Or if someone ever says like, I've been thinking about starting a podcast, they'll be like, I heard this girl on a podcast, you should check her out, and they send your profile, and it's like
Exactly.
this big, I don't know, waterfall effect
Yeah.
that comes from community building that I just kind of love.
I love it. I call it like constellation collaboration. Like you just
Mm.
never know what seeds are being planted that will turn into something. And it starts to feel like a constellation of like this connects here, which connects here, which connects back up. I actually have a story that I find really interesting about pivoting and people investing in your work and still being like a supporter of yours. Cause I think we were talking about community and constellation and, things that like people want to support you even when you pivot.
Mm.
So when I did mindset coaching, before I did that, I was talking about my life in Australia. I did an episode called Why I Moved to Australia. And this Italian woman found it. She had also moved to Australia and she's like, "Oh my God, I relate to this so much." And she just became like a super fan of the podcast. Like listened to so many episodes, constantly DMing me like, "I love this. Thank you. I'm also going through the same thing." And remember, this is before I had a business. I was not giving business advice or anything. It was just like, here's my life in Australia. Fast forward, I launched the mindset coaching course. She signs up. Right after that, I launched the one on one 3 month container I did. She signs up for that and pays in full. She ends up renewing with me for another 6 months, another 6 months. We worked together for like a year and a half. And then eventually, when I pivoted to podcast coaching, I knew she probably won't come with me because I don't think she wants to launch a podcast, which makes sense. I knew that was not going to happen. But I remember having this feeling of like feeling really guilty about pivoting because I was like, wow, I'm letting down all the people that were my like original supporters. Like they're going to be like, what are you doing? Like you were talking about mindset and mindfulness and now you're just switching on us. And like I really thought they were going to be like, go fuck yourself and like we're not going to follow you anymore. And like I don't know, I was really thinking worst case scenario. And she didn't obviously end up launching a podcast. Or maybe that's not obvious, but that just wasn't in her orbit at all. And I've always kept in touch throughout the years. A few years ago, I went to Berlin and she's like, you need to meet my friends, this woman that lives there. I met her friend. And now this year I'm going to Berlin. And I remember texting that same exact friend because we got along really well when I went to Berlin. And I was like, do you know anyone that's subleasing an apartment? And she's like, actually, I do. So I'm in Berlin this July coming up. I am subleasing from someone who listened to the podcast 4 years ago through a like third degree connection, who was her friend. And I was telling this story about my timeline recently on my Instagram, and that original woman that signed up for my course and worked with me one on one DM'd me and she's like, I still listen to your podcast. I just want you to know it's still like one of my favorites. I'm like, isn't that so cool that we have not worked together in like 2.5 years? She has not bought anything from me, but somehow through her, I've made a connection where now I have a place to stay in Berlin in July, that she is the person that will be the one that recommends me. Like, you have to go to Chelsea to launch a podcast, even though she never launched one. And I think that's the beauty of like showing your story online when it's not always about your business.
Yeah, it's like the relationships that get built through content. And like it's not even just podcasts, but I feel like podcasts build relationships differently than like Instagram or emails even because of they're listening to you talk, right? Like people come to you from podcasts and they're like, I feel like I know you. I feel like we're friends. I remember all these things you said. And I'm sitting there like, I don't know anything about you. You're a complete stranger.
Yeah,
like I'm like that to
I know,
you,
like,
you know? I'm like,
what?
yeah, I listen to your show. I know where you're at. Like, but it's like
It's so
it
wild.
makes you feel so much closer to people when you listen to their voice in your head. Because it like when I drove across
Yes.
Australia, I was like, I can listen to podcasts for hours where like I got bored listening to music because I had no signal. I could only like download so many Spotify songs, right? So it's like I could listen to podcasts way longer than I could listen to music because I felt like I was having a conversation with someone. So like the 36 hours of driving from Melbourne to Perth went much better with podcasts over like music. And like everyone was like, how are you doing this drive by yourself? And I'm like, I just listen to podcasts. Like it's totally cool.
Yeah. Just in a podcast. I'm like, do you know how much time passes? Like, that's why when I have long layovers too, when people are like, oh my God, it's this 8 hour layover, I'm like, I'm probably going to find a whole new series and listen to a podcast or like watch a
Yeah.
show. Like, it's really not a big deal for me at all. I'm like, there are so many cool, long podcasts out there that you just learn so much. And to your point, you feel very connected to the person.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, wow, I actually feel like this is beyond, because it's behind the screen. It's not, we know Instagram people are performing or showing their best foot forward. And even though we've opened up a lot on Instagram now, like people are way more open to sharing behind the
Yeah.
scenes, there's still a piece of like, I'm going to share this so that it's relatable, so that you will connect with me. Like there are still some really ugly sides of my life that I don't really like sharing on Instagram, but I might actually share on the podcast.
Yeah, yeah. And I get asked all the time, like, oh, how are you so vulnerable? How do you share so much? Like, I'm scared. And I'm just like, I share a lot, but there's still things you don't know, you know? And
Yeah.
it's like, it just
Yeah.
feels like I share a lot because I'm transparent and I'll talk about like my relationship, like when I met the Frenchman, when we like started dating, like moving to France, like all the struggles I've had with that, right? Like I share about it, like no problem. Or I'll talk about like
Right.
problems with clients, like not necessarily while it's happening, but I'll talk about like past situations just so like no one gets hurt, you know? But it's like if someone asks me a question, I'll answer it, you know? And I'm always like when I'm on
Right.
podcasts and they're like, do you have anything that's like off limits? I'm like, no. Like,
Yeah.
and I will stop
I'm like,
before I share something that will make me uncomfortable. Do you know? Like it's like
yeah. Yeah.
yeah, I don't know. Vulnerability to me
It
is
feels
like I feel like Instagram vulnerability is so performative.
Yes, it is. It's very we can almost predict now what it's going to look like when someone's like, "Here's some things I've been going through." And it's usually like, "I'm stressed," or "money," or this, and I'm like, because we've all adopted the same model, and I understand. I can empathize with it because Instagram started as a photo sharing
Hmm.
platform. It was never meant to be this like thing that it's turned into, this kind of monster, and we've all tried to adapt with it. And so I can empathize with that, but that's why also like before I buy from someone, I'm like, I want to go listen to them on a podcast and actually hear them and hear what they have to say, because I do feel like you can't really perform on podcasts. Like, sure, you can have a script. I think this is why people get over like the celebrity
Hmm.
podcast, because we know there's a publicist involved. They probably had press questions that were sent to the host before. And I think it's a little bit played out, and why we're all like, cool, we don't care about hearing from the same authors and celebrities and da da da, because we want to hear about like, okay, yeah, but like the nosy stuff. Like,
Yeah.
did you get in a fight with your partner when you were writing the book? Did you lose money? Did a relationship in your family break off? Because those are the things that we know happen because we've all been through them, but everyone's always showing the like PR version. And I think it's really hard to do that on a podcast when you're having a real conversation.
And if people do that, like you can hear that they're reading from a script. Like the way that you speak naturally and
Yes.
the way that you speak if you're reading from a teleprompter are very, very different. And like there's been shows that like I want to listen. I like the person. I found them on Instagram or something. I'm like, I want to know more about them. And I go to listen to their podcast or I go to listen to a guest episode. And I'm just like, your answers are so stilted. Like I don't trust that.
So stilted.
It makes me like trust their knowledge less because I'm like, this is supposed to be you talking about yourself or you talking about your area of expertise, and like you can't speak without a full script. Like, how well do you know it?
Yeah.
Like,
It's just not, yeah, like, isn't this your story? And I have a quick rant, and
Mhm.
I've been hesitant to share this rant, but I feel like we're gonna go there. But I feel like this is why I feel like Call Her Daddies, I feel like a level of decline is happening, because she used to have a lot more teeth in her interviews. Because I mean, remember, her podcast started out very sexual, raunchy, behind the
Mhm.
scenes. She was sharing every single detail of every single encounter that ever happened, and going back to specific storytelling. That's why it blew up. They weren't like, oh, if you're dating a guy, try this. It was like, this is exactly what we text him, pulling up their text messages, reading them. Like, people loved that stuff.
Yeah,
Then when they split off and she started doing the interviews with celebrities, people like them because they're like, "Ooh, this is a side of the celebrity I haven't seen." But now she's getting more and more A-listers that these teams have publicists and talent agents that are like,
it's
We have an
controlled.
image to portray here. Like, yeah, we can't we you can ask them like a few little probing questions, but I've noticed I've watched Alex for a very long time because I actually do admire her interview skills, and I think what she gets media, and I admire her from like that perspective of like, I think she really understands obviously podcasting and media. But I think now watching her, she doesn't push back on the celebrities a lot because she really can't.
Hmm.
Like, I can tell there's something that they say that's like, wait, what the fuck? And like usually she would be like, wait, like, what do you mean?
Say
Like, that doesn't
more.
make sense. But now she's like, oh, yeah. Now she's like, yeah, that makes sense. I can totally see that. And I'm like, oh, I just feel like it's losing its like grip that it had, because again, the publicists and PR teams are probably in the room being like, do not ask that question, or like the next question. Or they probably tell her like, hey, edit that out. Like, we don't actually want that airing.
Hmm.
Where I think this is why we're all, none of us, let me speak for myself. None of the people in my circle and myself really listen to like celeb podcasts anymore, because it's just not relatable. There's no humanization in it.
My husband, first of all, he lives under a rock, but he was like, "Have you ever heard of the Joe Rogan podcast?" I was like, "Yes, I've heard of it.
Like,
Have you ever
yeah,
listened to it?"
little old podcast.
I was like, "I listened to one episode. I'm not the target audience."
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not the
And
target
he's
audience
like,
either.
I've heard like someone that we know, like mutual friend. He's like, this person was like talking about it, saying like it's like the best podcast ever. And I was like, yeah, because it's for like straight white males. So that's why this guy
Yeah.
was hyping it up.
And
Like,
it's like fucking 4 hours long, that because guys have the audacity to think that people are interested in what they have to say for 4 hours.
and I was like,
It's
I can tell you,
insane.
you won't like it, but like, go for it. Listen to an episode.
Give it a shot. See what you think. Yeah, I it's so fascinating. I think I don't listen to it, but I do remember I will say the one I listened to was actually Miley Cyrus, and he did push back on her, and I think that's why he does so well too, because he will be like, I don't fucking care, like I'm gonna argue with you, like I'm gonna debate with you, and I do think that's why people tune in, because they're like, oh, he's gonna get the tea. Where a lot of the times people are like, I'm not gonna push back, I'm not gonna say anything. But yeah, his content does not resonate with me. It's just too long. I'm not the target audience at all.
I'm not. And it's like, for me, like he's just been around for so long, and I don't even know like what he's doing anymore. Like I didn't know he interviewed Miley Cyrus, but like when I remember like when I first found him, it must have been when I was in Australia. It's like 2016, 2017. And the episode that I listened to was about the carnivore diet, and he was talking with two dude bros. And they were talking about like weightlifting and gym and like the carnivore diet. And I was just like, why is this the number one podcast in the world?
No.
Didn't finish it. And I was like, I'll never listen to it again. And that's like my only impression of that show.
Yeah, and they're just really long. Like they're really, really long episodes. And I don't mind, like, I'm very verbose. Like I'm a very long-winded person, but like, I don't know. There's just some things that it's just unnecessary details. I don't think we need every single
nitty-gritty
light of the person's life story. Yeah. So it's not for me, but I think it goes back to you even saying like, I didn't relate to that. I think this is why we need more people like you and I that are just talking, shooting the breeze, conversating. Like we want to be more flies on the wall with people that we can relate to. And I think that's what podcasting allows people to do, is be that fly on the wall.
Yeah. And I'm going to have to pick your brain after this, because actually, no, pick your brain on this. I want to stop only listening to business podcasts, because I used to listen to like random ass podcasts. There was this one podcast that I listened to on my road trip, and it was a musical podcast. It was so good. But this was like 2017, and I've never found since then, but I also never looked since then, because back then there was no options. But I'm curious of like,
now there's options.
Not business podcasts, like whether it's travel, whether it's like life and dating, like give us some recommendations that are like non-business, because all I got is business.
I listen to purely only comedy and entertainment now. I don't listen to anything self-help, improvement, business. Like one that I listen to is, do you know Wondery Plus, or like Wondery, the media company?
No.
They're like kind of like the Netflix of podcasting to me. So do you remember there was a podcast called Dirty John, and there was another one called Dr. Death? Dirty John got turned into a Netflix show. So that's the type of like level of like storytelling that they're doing, is that these podcasts are turning into shows. I love their podcast because they're so well researched and produced. And they just did one called The Bachelor of Buckingham Palace, and it was about a reality TV show in the 90s where a guy that looked like Prince Harry was cast, and they got women from America to come on and thought they were like dating Prince Harry, and it was called I Want to Marry Harry. So it was like that type of show. It's like an investigative podcast of like, how the hell did this air? How did this happen? Did people really believe it? But then as you get further into the show, it's actually more about the psychology of reality TV, and the like kind of like mental abuse that happens to contestants on shows. And is it okay to lie to people on shows and think that they're dating? So like, I don't know. It was so fascinating. I'm like, that's the stuff that I'm really into. So Wondery, if you go there, all their shows, I love them. I also listen to one that like is low-key probably problematic. It's called How Long Gone. It's these two guys. They live in New York and LA, but they do a lot of like cultural commentary. Like we'll talk about the Met Gala and the Kendrick versus Drake beef,
want this. This is,
you know, Hailey Bieber getting pregnant. Like it's just so random and it's so niche, but I think I like it a lot because I don't live in America. I haven't lived there in a very long time, so it kind of like keeps me updated on like American news. And they very much do not care what people think. They're like, no, like they're not trying to sugarcoat anything. So like they'll just talk shit about celebrities and things going on in the news that are like kind of what we're all thinking, but they just say it out loud. So that's why I like that show, because it just goes there, and they're very opinionated, and I kind of appreciate like the snark. And then speaking of snarky, If Books Could Kill, it's a show with two guys that go over books that are like self-help. Like they did one on The Secret, and then Lean In, and like The Art of the Deal, and they just basically kind of rip it apart.
Oh, I like that.
Oh, yeah, both they rip it apart both from an opinionated perspective, but research, because one of the guys is a lawyer and the other one is like a professional producer slash like podcast guy. He was a journalist.
Mhm.
So it's a journalist and a lawyer using their lens to be like, this is why
This is
this book doesn't
problematic.
work. It's not just like, oh, it's bad yeah, it's not bad writing. It's like, no, this is like scientifically not true, or like this opinion, or like they got this study from a study that was done on 3 people. Like they'll rip it apart that way. And so that's the type of stuff I like, that I'm like, get in there. I want to see you go after them. And yeah, If Books Could Kill is incredible. I have so many more. I'm like looking through my queue. If you want me to keep going, I will. But those are ones that are like constantly in my rotation.
No, I think that's good. I'm like, the only non-business podcast I've listened to in the last year was I started listening to Boy Meets Pod, because I'm a massive Boy Meets World fan.
Ooh.
And they,
Ooh.
Topanga, Sean, and Eric, I'm like, I'll just use character names because it'll be easier for everyone listening.
Yes.
They made a podcast where they are watching the original, like the episodes, like in order, and then recording an episode after it of like their thoughts, of like the memories they have from it. I'm like sitting there laughing, crying because I remember everything, you know? And I'm just like, I was listening to it when I was in Vancouver and I was like, I just want to watch the episodes with them. But it was really good. And they're interviewing, like they interviewed Minkus, they've interviewed Mr. Feeney, like.
So I need to go. I loved Topanga, was like my hair goal. Like they were like my ideal couple. Like she was my hair goals. I was like, I want a boyfriend like him. Like I loved that show. And my podcast brain is turning on right now, where I'm like, from a media standpoint, you have to look at that and be like, this is how powerful podcasting is, that they are bringing people that filmed the show decades ago to come back and recap it. They did this with The Office too. They have Pam and Angela recapping episodes of The Office on a podcast. I'm like, these choices aren't random, right?
Yeah.
Like people do this because people get nostalgic, people want to hear it. And exactly what you're talking about, they're getting personal and like bringing up something that you're like, oh my God, but it's the behind the scenes. This is why podcasting is so cool, because it's like what was really happening in everyone's heads. And I need to go listen to that.
Because it's incredible. Like me, who I own them. They're literally in my sister's apartment. I own all 7 series of Boy Meets World on like DVD.
Wow.
I also own a bunch of Saved by the Bell, but I didn't watch Saved by the Bell when it aired. I think it's a little older than me. I just bought it because I thought it looked cool. But I've watched all the episodes. A good one. It's like if Mario Lopez did a podcast about Saved by the Bell, I would listen to it.
Yeah, and I'm sure, I guarantee you there is, I think he does have a podcast, to be honest. I think him and his wife have a podcast.
But I feel like it's not about Saved by the Bell.
Yeah, it's probably not about Saved by the Bell. And then, you know what? In the next 6 to 12 months, I would not be shocked if like 3 members of the cast come out with a recap podcast like that.
Yeah, because as far as I've seen from Boy Meets Pod, it's like, or is it Pod Meets World? Pod Meets World. That sounds better. It's like doing really well. And especially because they now have like Girl Meets World, which is like the spinoff. Like I think it's, as a marketing standpoint, like great numbers for them, you know?
Oh my gosh. Yes. And now I'm thinking too of Laguna Beach. Kristen and Steven came back and did Back to the Beach, and they did the same thing. They started all the episodes, started watching together, recapping like what really happened. And I'm like, this is amazing that we're now, you know, a lot of that stuff was so scripted and like, like no one knew what was going on. And now it's like, we're going to show you what was really going on. And they're like
explaining like this part was in front of a live audience. This is laugh tracks. This is like, this got messed up and like nobody could do anything and you just had to roll with it.
Oh my God.
I love it.
I love that. I love, like, I'm obsessed with behind the scenes stuff. So I need to run and download this.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm going to wrap us up here. Do you have anything else you'd like to add?
I think since we've been on this podcast train and there might be people being like, oh, but you know, you're talking about a celebrity talking about their recaps like in a show they did, or Call Her Daddy is a Spotify backed podcast, and like think like I don't really know what I have to say. I just want to remind you, there are podcasts for literally anything out
Mm-hmm.
there. There's a podcast actually that I listen to that's also not business called Watch What Crappens, and it's mimicking Watch What Happens on Bravo. All they do each week is break down the recaps of Bravo episodes. This podcast blew up. It is their full-time job. They go on tour, they sell merch. They're literally doing a European tour to recap episodes of Bravo. So you do not have to be an expert. You can pick something you love to do. Like recently I was watching a documentary and I was like, I fucking love documentaries. I don't know why I don't have a podcast breaking down documentaries and like shooting the shit with someone about them. And now that's like on my radar. And I'm like, you can start a podcast like that. You could start a podcast. There was a podcast reviewing tater tots that I've seen. Like you can literally do whatever you want. So this is just a reminder, like you do not have to be an expert. You can find a rabbit hole obsession and you can talk about that on a podcast. So don't get tied up in a, like, I don't have a business and I don't know what to talk about and how am I going to, relate to people and I don't want to share my story. It's like literally go talk about your favorite salads. Like literally that could be a podcast.
Yeah.
And just see what happens.
I mean, like,
I really think you need to go down rabbit holes that fast.
I went down the rabbit hole of like the serial killer podcast, like I was really into My Favorite Murder, and it's the same thing. They do tours, they have merch, they're like massive celebrities now in the podcast world.
Yeah.
But it's like podcasting can be so much more than like a marketing vehicle, which is what I think like all 100%. Entrepreneurs look at it as. But like for me, like I don't keep my podcast like, yes, it's business entrepreneur niche, but I don't keep it to like my content repurposing niche because I know like it is so much more. And like every time people ask me like, what is the entrepreneur? Like, what does that mean? Like, I see your agency, but like, what's this? And I'm just like, this is like my personal brand. And like, I can see like growing like beyond my agency, like giving my agency a manager and like going back either to like coaching or like more speaking opportunities. I'd really love to like speak on stages and stuff. And I'm just like, I think that Unprofessional Entrepreneur is like my personal brand, and it's gonna be like the thing that grows with me beyond. Do you know? And it's like,
that makes so much sense.
Yeah, like not everything is your entire business.
Yeah. You are not a brand, you're a human being. Mm-hmm. That's like one of my favorite taglines. So I feel like that's a perfect place to end. You're not a brand, you're a human.
And yeah, I'm like, perfect ending here. Where can the people find you?
You can find me at chelseariffe.com. That's where if you want to launch a podcast, you can check out my freebie, How to Start a Podcast. I can give that to you to plug in the show notes. Mm-hmm. And then if you want to read my writing, which Feli was talking about, she getting some of the tea of my travels, that's on Substack called Slight Turbulence. Those are the best places to find me. And then my podcast, In My Non-Expert Opinion.
Mm-hmm. Of course, you have to mention that.
Have to mention that, obviously.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming. This was so good. I am so excited to put this out. And to everyone listening, I will catch you all next week on another episode of The Unprofessional Entrepreneur.